Hello again, everyone. My name is Marissa Davis. I am founder and principal of Tallawah Consulting, where we work with a range of mission-driven brands to help them maximize their impact by using equity, innovation, and inclusion to drive their core strategy forward. We've been having a series of talks, through our Tallawah Talks series, and our second series, our season 2, has been focused on inclusive capital, just looking at the intersection of where capital meets inclusion and some of the stuff in between. And I'm really happy that, we've had a range of folks that we've been speaking with, but today, very happy that we have Dr. Angela Jackson to speak with about both her current experiences and just her work in navigating this space. So before we begin, as always, as is customary, I just like to give you guys a little sense of who the individuals are that we're speaking with. And we'll get right into a conversation after that. So first of all, thank you, Dr. Jackson, for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me. I'm just excited to be here.
Awesome. So as I mentioned, just a little bit about Dr. Angela Jackson. So she's currently in her capacity as managing partner at New Profit. She leads their Future of Work initiative. So this seeks to close the career readiness gap for Americans from low income backgrounds. But prior to that, has spent a lot of time in the private sector where, she had been on a quest after her time in the private sector, had been on a diligent quest to try and answer this question of if multinational companies can deliver their products consistently and with quality at scale, what would it take to actually deliver those social interventions like education and health in a similar manner? And she's gone about trying to answer that question in a number of ways, one through her founding of Global Language Project. It's a social venture that aimed to transform how we prepare students with skills to succeed in a global economy and workforce. Also through her doctoral studies at Harvard, where she worked on focusing on both that question and understanding the role more broadly of scale and strategic capital deployment and philanthropy in systems change initiatives. And now again, in her role at New Profit, where she's leading a $15 million Future of Work global fund to invest in entrepreneurs and companies developing innovative technical solutions to upskill low-income and entry-level workers at scale. Her work has been featured in a number of spaces: CNN, Huffington Post, Chicago Tribune, Stanford Social Innovation Review, to name a few. But again, we're just really happy that you're here to join us for this conversation. So
absolutely. No, let's get into it. I'm excited too. And you list all those places where I've written, but I think these one-to-one conversations are really my favorite, to really have people get a peek inside not only the investments and the thoughts, just the story behind it. So I just appreciate having this opportunity to talk with you today.
Awesome. Well, I certainly appreciate having you. And so, first question here. Capital can be leveraged in a number of different ways, right? Via philanthropy, venture capital, impact investing, places beyond and in between. Where do you fall within this work, and what inspired you to enter this space in the first place?
Right. So at New Profit, like you mentioned, I lead the Future Work strategy and investments, which includes that $15 million Future Work Fund. So that's philanthropic funding that we put out. And what New Profit has done for over 20 years is that we've invested in entrepreneurs who are really trying to solve complex social problems at scale. We're really typically agnostic to issue. The reason why we focused on the future work, and this is pre the pandemic, we really thought about automation and who was going to be disproportionately impacted. And we see what happened when COVID hit, right? So the future of work, I tell people, became the present of work in a matter of a couple of weeks. We saw job losses in sectors that we thought were normally recession proof. Think, the restaurant industry, think hospitality. And so it has really accelerated in many people's minds the import of thinking about how do we upskill people at scale beyond a four-year institution. And so the dollars that we look at are making sure as a philanthropy that we are investing them in a way for the people who are going to have to be most impacted by these problems. And so we identified that there's 73 million Americans who don't have a degree. And so thinking about like, how do we invest in those folks? Because typically, if you look at employers where they invest their dollars right into upskilling, training, it's targeted towards their highest wage earners. That's where they spend 80% of their dollars. And if you go downstream to entry-level workers or lower wage workers, their professional development is really focused on compliance and it's focused on safety. But we know as a country, right, that we are going to need to invest more in the people who don't have degrees, because the jobs that are growing are the ones that are higher wage jobs. And there are more of these in these kind of future forward sectors. And so when we look at our capital, we look at it as grant capital, catalytic capital, and we look at it as for scaling. You know, if you look at traditional philanthropy, it's mostly about programs. You know, we're going to give you dollars to do X. It's very prescribed. At New Profit, we're investing in the entrepreneur and them as an expert and telling us what do they need, where do they need to invest the dollars so that they can reach their potential, so that they can scale their impact. So it's a very different approach that we have. We feel like we're shoulder to shoulder with an entrepreneur. We're not saying do future work. Like we want you to work in that realm, but we're not saying you have to do a program, you have to serve this many people. We're saying, what do you need in terms of capital to reach, instead of hundreds of people, thousands of people?
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a combination of a different approach to who you're focusing on, right? Who you're investing in, and also just the way the investments are done and made, you know? So I'm curious just what even got you into entering this space in the first place, just within your own experiences.
Yeah, so I had a successful career in the private sector. You mentioned my resume. I worked at Nokia and worked at Viacom and worked internationally, built businesses for those companies. And then I go on to found Global Language Project. And I didn't know that I was doing anything radical. One, by being a woman, and being a woman of color, a Black woman founding an organization. So I didn't know any of the rates that we know that, when you think about VC funding, for example, less than 1% goes to women of color. When you think about philanthropic funding, right, less than 7% goes to people of color. I didn't know those stats. I saw a problem in my community that I felt like children were not receiving the education around like world culture and world language. I was like, they need that, because I was working in an international capacity. So I founded this, and I just assumed that, my reputation, my experience, my success building these businesses in the private sector would be acknowledged, like in this kind of philanthropic social enterprise world. And I was in for a rude awakening. When I came in, a lot of the stats that we read, I faced those. I didn't realize that a lot of my success was based on having a platform of Viacom and Nokia. And so when I was starting a new venture that was Angela, right, Angela Jackson, that I began to get questions I didn't even get before. So I wasn't even prepared to ask them. I knew, I had the problem I was trying to solve. I had the research, I had a demonstrated need and market. I thought, okay, you have all of those things in my experience, money should follow. Right. And what you'll hear from many entrepreneurs is that's not the case. And so I did go on to raise, over $10 million for Global Language Project. We served, 60,000 students, hundreds of teachers, curriculum nationwide, and also did some programs internationally. But I realized it shouldn't have been that hard. I had the experience, I had the business plan, I had the advisors, everything that they tell you to have. It's check, check, check. I had proof of concept. I had data, right? I had like premier partners, Columbia University. So all of the things that they say you should have, I had all of those, and still the money didn't flow. And I received questions like, well, why do kids need to learn a second language? Shouldn't we worry about if they're eating? And so for me, it was like, these are like false choices, right? Yes, they should have food and have access to clean water, and they should have this exposure to world curriculum. And so what I wanted to do is, when I went back to do my doctoral research, I wanted to understand, was this a problem that I was just having as an individual, or was this reflective of a larger experience of entrepreneurs of color and how these dollars for impact were being invested? And so what we've seen after I did my doctoral work and research, and we've seen recent research coming out of Echoing Green and Bridgespan, we know that there is what we call a new profit, a reputation to revenue gap. So you have these founders who have all of the accolades, they have degrees, they had received money, for example, from Echoing Green. And when they went out as a cohort to fundraise and do follow-up funding, the entrepreneurs of color received less money. They received more restricted money, and they had more meetings to get that money versus their cohort of white peers who are also coming out of Echoing Green. Again, very similar credentials, similar size, similar stages and growth. So that lets us know that we need more people on the other side. And, a big shout out to Cheryl Dorsey, who leads Echoing Green, and to Bridgespan for doing the research. We need people on the other side, on the funding side, that recognize that this is an issue, that's starting to document this issue with hard data. But we also need people in the seat like myself, like Cheryl, who are influencing these funding decisions. And so that's what made me want to shift over. I didn't have my own idea to do next. I love entrepreneurs. I love supporting entrepreneurs, but I thought I could be best situated coming from an operator to now being on this side as an investor and really trying to close and really solve for that capital access gap.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even making that shift has different implications, right? I mean, you obviously within your position at New Profit, that is but one group. And as you mentioned, the work that Cheryl Dorsey and Echoing Green is doing is another piece. So what do you think the potential is for what is possible if there are not just one New Profit or just one Echoing Greens, but several other entities that are funneling their resources and capital in a way that is meeting this, this reputation to revenue gap?
Yes. Well, there's a couple things. And, the work that Echoing Green did and the work that, New Profit did was pre-pandemic. And what has happened in this moment, right? There's been this racial reckoning, and you have lots of corporations who are now attuning to, we need to, invest in entrepreneurs of color. We need to bring on more diverse suppliers. And so that's all exciting. And they've made public commitments behind how many billions of dollars, millions and billions of dollars that they're going to put into that. So in my perspective, there's a few things that need to happen. First is there needs to be some accountability around that. And so this is why I love social media and love like the wisdom of the crowd. And we're seeing some of that already online where people are starting to track those commitments. I just received an email earlier this week from Comcast where they made very transparent, what their commitment was and how they're delivering on it. I think that there will be a call to see more of that. And then the other thing I think about is once we have the data, and that's why I refer back to the Bridgespan and Echoing Green report, data matters. The more that we can begin to push corporations and even foundations to be more transparent about their investing, that's how we can make change, because that's how you can hold people accountable. And then the last piece that I think about, if we think about having this actually sustain and systemic changes, we have to think about as people of color, as entrepreneurs of color, I tell people we are the ones that we've been waiting for. When I'm called an investor, and I'm using quotes because I invest, but everyone is an investor. And when I remember when I started Global Language Project, someone said, well, don't you have to be rich to start an organization? Like, we have to demystify what does it mean to start an organization, to be an entrepreneur, demystify what it means to be an investor. I started angel investing. The first investment I made was $500. And someone may say that's not a lot of money, but to that entrepreneur who needed that capital at that time, right, it was significant. And what we need to understand about an entrepreneur's journey and equity, they're going to need different types of capital at different stages. So if someone wants to help someone, they can start angel investing with $100, $500. There's an organization called Funder, Fundr, founded by Lauren Washington, and she's a co-founder Boris. They're democratizing investments, right? So you can go on their site right now and start investing in startups as little as $500 and to start getting into that, because there's a lot of money that's being made from investments. The other piece we need to realize is, as people of color, as investors is like, we need to start putting our dollars in that market too and find out ways to do that, because that's going to expand the pie. We don't have to wait until we have $1 million or wait until you have $1,000. Again, that as little of a $500 investment can make a significant difference, depending on where an entrepreneur is.
Yeah. No, and I mean even this idea of demystifying investment kind of changes also the funnel of it just not being up to the big venture capital groups or philanthropic spaces, but actually putting that in the hands of the everyday person who is also interested in supporting a particular initiative or entrepreneurial endeavor. So, I mean, you had mentioned Funder, being a potential platform and just speaking to people more broadly about the opportunities that are out there. Are there any other ways that you think would be important or things that can be done to demystify this idea of investing, particularly for the communities that haven't often seen themselves as part of this process?
Right. We have to reimagine, a lot of people talk about financial health and financial literacy.
Mm-hmm.
We need to broaden that. Typically, when we have those conversations, it's from a deficit view. So you're talking about people who, have, less access to capital. We're saying they need to be more fiscally responsible with their dollars. But actually, need to think about how do we educate people on not only being more responsible, but the opportunities that are out there. And I'll give you one prime example. This year, because of the pandemic, people could take a $350 deduction if they gave to charity, and it would come straight off of their taxable income. How many people would understand what that could mean for them and what that benefit could be, right? And what that benefit could be to organizations, philanthropic organizations, if everyone took advantage of that. And so those are things that we need to educate people, because there's lots of opportunities like that one, that if we don't leverage it or give people the information, they can't access it. And we saw this with the PPE loans, right? When we talk about access to different types of capital,
Right.
if you don't educate people how to get them, it can be out there, but they will never take advantage of it. So we really have to invest at the community level. And that's something that I am doing with the Future of Work Grand Challenge, is going into communities. Like, we launched this challenge to surface innovations, but what we're doing is we're putting them on the ground in communities. I'm working with local community colleges and workforce boards and local leaders to make sure it can be metabolized and that people really understand what the offering is. I can say train for this job for the future, but what does that mean if I'm not educated someone on what that means? And talking about making things accessible, I think about that a lot with the future of work. Personally, I was raised by my grandparents in Chicago. I'm a first generation college student. Like, when you talk about the future of work, that would have meant nothing to them, right? They were concerned with paying their bills, every month, putting food on the table and getting us to school. And so we need to, like, first and foremost, ground all of these theories, investing, philanthropy in the lived experiences of people. Like, how do you make it accessible for people with busy lives, with multiple responsibilities, if we actually really want to engage them and center them in this process?
Right. No, absolutely. I mean, that even this piece centering people, those individuals within this process, that's, I think, one of the key considerations that a number of companies and organizations are trying to figure out how to do. So I know you touched on this a little bit in the beginning, but specifically as it relates to weaving inclusion, into how you show up. What has that specifically looked like for your particular work at New Profit?
Yeah, so I just want to say everything that we do is centered on worker voice and the people that we're trying to serve. And so even when I came in, my first order of business, when they told me they wanted me to lead the future of work strategy, I said, okay, what have you done so far and who have you talked to? And at first they had talked to, corporations, they talked to employers, they talked to researchers, to Harvard, to Brookings,
Right.
but they hadn't talked to any workers.
Mm.
And they hadn't talked to anyone directly that's serving workers. And I was like, well, we have to stop and we have to make sure, is this something that people want? Are we even messaging the right way? Like, how do we know that this is even needed? You know, our hypothesis is that it is based on the research, but how do we know in its form that we're conceptualizing it is something the community wants? And so what we started doing is really having listening tours with workers and with organizations that serve workers, like the Workers Lab, Perscolas, Year Up, for example. We're serving like Opportunity Youth to really understand like what are the problems they're solving for and how could we help them, not do something different, but really do something that could be additive to the ecosystem. From there, we stood up a worker advisory board in collaboration with Goodwill and Accenture. And that board helps us choose the entrepreneurs and solutions we invest in. They actually test them. They give us feedback, and then mutually, we actually compensate these workers for their time for participating because we want it to be a mutually beneficial relationship. And what has come out of that has been amazing. Just this week, we were told by MIT that part of the process, like when we looked at the applications, like we asked questions about inclusion. Who's on your team? How do they know that this is going to be beneficial to workers? Who have they talked to? And then we also put steps into the process where they would actually put their solutions in front of workers. And MIT Solve shared with us that because of this work together and this process that we built, like it's changed how they are approaching their applications moving forward. And it's changed some of the questions they're putting in on their applications. And so when I think about systems change, it's what we do internally at New Profit, but it's also how we use our platform, the money that we're investing as a lever. When I talk about my research around using capital as levers for systems change, capital is a big lever that we can use if used responsibly, right? To have people that are vendors, that are partners that we work with. We just talk about our values and our non-negotiables. And one is centering it and integrating workers. And so if it doesn't work for the workers, if we don't have time to get their input, and if we can't really act on it, then we shouldn't be doing it.
Right. No, and I mean, even some of Justin, you mentioning that it's expanding sort of the way we're thinking about this, that it's not just about, the capital that it's funneled. It's not just about the capital that is funneled, to focus on these individuals and communities, but it's actually working with and alongside them to get the insights that is beyond just some kind of research or some academic kind of approach to this work. And so even as we're thinking about that, I mean, you're operating then within a system that there has been a traditional model or framework for doing this work, and you're presenting something that is different from that. So have there been certain challenges that you've had to face in trying to both center in a more inclusive way the individuals that you're trying to serve, and thinking about the resources that you're using? Yeah, what have those challenges looked like, if there have been any?
Yeah, so there have been internal challenges, and there have been external. And so I'll start with the internal. To really do this work of like centering the people that you're aiming to support, to help, to work alongside, you're gonna have to go slower. And typically in any organizations, people want to get fast. They want to go fast. They want to know what the results are, how quickly can we get the outcomes. And in theory, that's great because there is some urgency around like this problem. We've got historic unemployment, but we know when we go fast, we usually take shortcuts. Shortcuts like, who are the entrepreneurs that we're looking at? Like, one thing we want to do, we want to cast a wide net. It wasn't about who did we already know. We wanted to know who else was out there that we didn't know. And so it takes time to find those entrepreneurs. You're gonna have to partner with different people to identify those entrepreneurs. And then once you select them, like I mentioned to you, it takes time to network and get them in community with the actual workers and the people that we aim to actually help. And then the third part of it is the education that we talked about earlier. We also worked with the workers, like the people who are in our worker advisory board, so that they could be able to actually give feedback, right? So we had to do some education with them around what does future of work mean? What are the programs that are out there? What would it mean if someone actually centered you in their solution? Because you have to realize we're dealing with a population and a system that has never centered them. And so they have to imagine a possibility that's never been presented to them. And the sessions I've sent in with our workers, it's been heartbreaking for me. When we first started with them, questions they've asked us when they joined the worker board was like, I was a terrible student. I dropped out of high school. I'm not for sure if I can do this. These are people who've been failed by our system over and over again. So now that we're presenting them with this opportunity and say, we're going to center it and ask what you want, and we're going to actually, take your feedback and integrate it, like, there's some education and just curriculum we had to do around that. So that's going slower. And then some entrepreneurs, they're not interested in that. Some entrepreneurs that we invest in are, at the intersection of profit and purpose. Some of them are just really about profit, right? And they see 73 million Americans that they could serve, or US residents that they could serve. That's what they're going for. So they might not be on board with our process. So we had to separate those. And so that was internally. Externally, what that was, and I talked a bit about with the entrepreneurs, it was also our partners. As I mentioned with MIT Solve, so we also have XPRIZE, we had to ask them to change their processes that they had been operating with for, over a decade.
Which is not easy.
It is not easy, right? And sharing research, and that took, learning conversations to understand that, we weren't doing this just out of a requirement, right? We're doing this because we think at the end of it, we're going to have better solutions and better outcomes. We're doing this in service of impact. Yeah. Not just reporting. And so, but that takes an education too, depending on where people are in terms of their DEI journey and how they feel about inclusion. And so it's taking the time to do that. And it's also having partners who want to be receptive to go there with you.
Right. And I mean, within the entrepreneurial world and just kind of startup kind of thinking, time is often that thing that people are kind of working against and thinking, we're doing it faster, doing it better. But what you seem to be saying is that time, yes, is important, but in order to do this well, if we're really trying to serve and center these individuals who historically have been left out of these conversations, you have to take that time.
You have to take that time. So one of the investors, we raise funds to then distribute the funds. And so a potential co-investor said to me, and I won't name their name, but this is 2 years ago when I was first raising this fund. I said, will you want to invest? And they were like, well, when are you going to launch this? I was like, it's going to launch in a year and a half. This was pre-COVID when I was raising this fund. They're like, oh, in a year and a half, we'll be on to something else. We won't even be doing future work. And I was like, really? They were not interested. What we were proposing to do this work in the process was too long for them. They're like, we don't want to commit for 3 years. We'll do a year. What type of data will you have in a year? You're going too slow. Right. And fast forward, this was all pre-COVID. Fast forward, we did it the right way, because when COVID hit, we had a very deep strategy, a very well thought out strategy with the population that was truly impacted, has been most impacted. And so that helped, but that was a realization that early on, there are going to be some people who will walk away and that you'll have to walk away from.
Right. And that is part of the process of, if you're doing something in a new way, you might have to reimagine the partners that are in place, or how it is that you're working with, individuals who are looking to work with these communities, right?
Yeah.
And,
I was just going to say, I would just add, if you're doing systems change, if you're really trying to solve a systemic issues, I would tell your audience to check out this framework called the Water of Systems Change by John Kenya, Kramer, Peter Senge. When you think about having real systems change, you got to change people's mental beliefs and models, and that takes work. It's easier to do the surface things and look at the surface outcomes, but when you do that deep work about changing beliefs, that takes time.
Yeah. So then I'll flip that question then. I asked you about the challenges, to doing this work and prioritizing both systems change, centering equity, and inclusion, and, funneling the right kinds of capital to these individuals. What are the opportunities that you then see in doing this work and taking the time and being deliberate?
Yeah. So a couple of things I love, and I'll just do a plug for this. I wrote a piece last year for Stanford Social Review. And it was on proximity, and we showcased 3 case studies of leaders that New Profit is invested in. One is, for example, is Girl Trek, and they have succeeded in getting 1 million Black women walking. And when we think about what they were trying to accomplish at the time was like how to get Black women healthy, and many other people have tried, but they really approached it from a weight loss perspective. They didn't really think about holistically what are women up against, what are the systemic barriers and structures that are keeping women unhealthy, and particularly Black women. And so by doing that work, they were able to accomplish a couple of things. One is women got moving, so they're getting healthier, right? They're in community, which is helping not only their physical health, but their mental well-being. And because they're walking in community, they're starting to get things done. They see potholes, they see signs that needs to be replaced. They're calling 311. And so they're actually having a great impact on the community. But like if they had have just tackled it, right, from a weight loss perspective, we would have like really missed those overarching systems wide impacts that are going to make life better for everyone in their community, right? So when they're beyond losing weight, when they're mentally healthy and can bring them their full selves to work, like what does that mean for that company and the benefits they're getting, right? They're going to be better producers at work. And then their community, when they're helping to get things done, elected officials, grassroots, like that makes life better for everyone, their neighbors who are living to the left and to the right of them. And that's what we're going after. I think when we talk about philanthropy, though, when we want to solve these complex social problems, like you have to have an expansive view of the problem, really. And that's when you're going to have more impact than just the people you're aiming to serve. You can have a lot of downstream impact too.
Yeah, which I think gets me, I think, to my final question here, which is, I think, a perfect way to end is when it's all said and done, right? What does impact look like when you have done all that you had mentioned from the beginning, taking the time to really understand the individuals and communities that have not historically been seen as recipients of the right kind of investment, after having done the partnerships with the institutions and organizations that are investors with you. What does impact look like after all of that?
Yeah, so Marissa, I'm gonna tell you, you have to rinse and repeat. You have to do it all again because it's not a destination, I tell people, it's a process. It really is. And it's something where even now, I have a strategy meeting coming up with my team on Monday. We did this all along, but we have to check in and say, okay, this is where we are in the life cycle of this, like these investments, this strategy. What else do we need to do to deliver on that commitment? What's the next step? Because there's always more to be done.
Right.
And so we have to think about, and I think, people say you want to get away from checkbox diversity and inclusion, because that's saying I've done it, it's over. For it to really be living and for you to have that continued impact is something you need to check in on. It's need to say, how do I do it more? What are the blind spots? Who are we missing? And I think when you're doing it right, that's built into your process. Right? You can check in and everyone knows what that process is. And you're doing it at the corporate level, you're doing it at the executive level, you're doing it at the team level. And then you have your staff members who are doing it at the individual level, because that all ramps up into this better space and what I call this more equitable future work that we want to see. But it's going to take that continual work and ongoing, because we're fighting against a system that doesn't operate that way in our framework. And so unless we build that muscle, we're not going to get to this kind of ideal state. But the ideal state for me really is a process that you can check in and that you're knowing that you're doing continually. And then you'll see more and more outcomes and impact coming from that.
Right. So I think what I'm hearing is that there's impact looks iterative. It isn't just one. It doesn't end and begin at one place. You might kind of start at one place, you work through that surface, but then you're cutting through deeper and deeper layers to continue to just get to the whole, seeing impact more broadly and more expansive, and including the range of issues that individuals, entrepreneurs, for example, the key group that you're working with right now.
Right.
Looking at it.
Yeah, I would just say the thing about that, just to further clarify for that, is that it's about being iterative, but when you think about the problems that we all are trying to solve, when we think about, equity, inclusion, closing some of the racial wealth gaps, right? These have been like 100, over a century in the making. And so it's not good. Exactly. It's very entrenched. So it's not going to happen and then voila, it's going to be magic. And I try to push against that because that's what people want. That's like that old framework of then like we do X, Y, and Z and the magic will happen and everyone will be happy. Well, we still know that there's a lot of people who are not being included. We talk about along the lines of race and gender, but also thinking about abilities. If you look hard enough, there's always someone who's probably being excluded, and there's a way that you can be more inclusive in your policies. And so that's what we want to push forward and saying, continue to look, continue to ask what your blind spots are, and continue to look around the table and say, okay, who's not sitting here that should be here?
Yeah, absolutely. Gems upon gems, Angela. Thank you so much, for all that you shared today, and really for just your continued work and leadership within this space. For individuals who want to continue to follow you and your work, how can they go about doing that?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter at AngJack, ANGJACK. If you Google Angela Jackson and New Profit, my pages will come up so you can see those. And just before I go, I want to congratulate you on your work and also this podcast. It's inspiring, and this conversation was just a joy. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.